Welcome to Insight Connect, an initiative where we welcome a range of international and local experts to share their views, experience, and insights on cultural intelligence and why it matters. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Kathrin Schmidt. Kathrin is a senior consultant in the creative and cultural sectors with a very specific focus on African markets. Together, we'll be exploring the shifts in the creative and cultural economy, specifically in Africa, and how this represents opportunities for global businesses and brands. Welcome, Kathrin. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Hi, Melanie, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here as well. And thank you for inviting me to discuss all these interesting questions with you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So, as you know, culture is a very broad concept and one that encompasses many layers and means different things to different people. And we, in fact, have both built our career on culture, but we come from two different perspectives. Your expertise focuses very much on the overarching concept of culture when it comes to the arts, which in effect influences behaviors and trends, which is where I come from effectively. So to start with, could you tell us a bit more about your story and how, why, when you landed in this space, and particularly why a focus on the African continent?
Yeah, I guess I always had an interest in arts and culture, and the kind of narrow and broader sense. And I then did my first degree in French and cultural studies, and then did a master's in arts management, and that's how I guess sort of started my career in this field, so working mainly with theatre companies and festivals. And then in my mid-20s, I moved to Sierra Leone, where I worked with a theatre company. And I guess this was sort of my first experience of working in the cultural and creative industries in Africa. And then as a result of this experience that I had while living and working in Sierra Leone, and all the kind of questions that came up during that time, with regards to the cultural sector, in Sierra Leone, in West Africa, and Africa more broadly, but then also kind of looking at the really bigger ecosystem. I just got really interested in all these different layers and influences that shaped this sector. And so as a result of all these questions I embarked on a PhD on the political economy of cultural and creative industries in Sierra Leone and West Africa more broadly. So I've been sort of thinking and researching this topic for a long time. And then so halfway through my PhD, I moved from working in arts management to consulting in the cultural and creative industries. First, mostly in the UK, because I was doing my PhD in London. And then 10 years ago, I moved to Kenya. And so since then, most of my work has been across Africa. So working with international organizations, mostly on strategy, program development, and mapping and impact studies. And I think it's just also a really exciting time, to sort of be involved in this sector in Africa, because it's moving very quickly, it's changing very quickly. There's a lot of dynamism, and a lot of especially young creative entrepreneurs doing really exciting things. So I think it's quite an exciting time for the sector in Africa.
And you went from west to east, so quite a lot of differences, I would imagine, and the work you see and the creativity and the projects must be really fascinating. So actually, from your work and experience, what do you see as the most overlooked contribution that the cultural and creative sectors can bring to sustainable development on the continent?
That's a question that is really very close to my heart, and a lot of the work that I do sits at this sort of interconnection between culture, creativity, and sustainable development. And I think one of the most overlooked contributions of culture and creativity to sustainable development in Africa, but I would say even beyond in other regions, is culture's role in building social infrastructure. And this includes like building trust, a sense of belonging, but also a capacity for collective action. Because I think often when we talk about sustainable development, the focus is on economic growth or job creation or kind of physical infrastructure. And of course, it's true that the creative economy also creates jobs and also provides livelihoods for a lot of people. But I think, what is much less recognized is that culture really shapes this relational fabric that makes development possible in the first place. And I think that's also why it is so important to recognize that we need to think of development as very locally specific, and we always need to think about the local value. And I think only a very kind of culture sensitive approach to development can achieve that. And I think I see that a lot in the projects that I work on. Cultural and creative practices do create spaces where people can engage across difference, where people meet who otherwise would not meet, where they negotiate identity, but where they address challenges or where they rebuild trust. And I think this is really, really important, especially in contexts of inequality or fragmentation. And unfortunately, a lot of African contexts are marked by quite a lot of fragmentation or sort of continuing inequality. So I think this is a really foundational point that without trust and this sort of sense of belonging, but also sense of community, institutions struggle to function, and then civic participation remains limited as well. And then all of that affects development outcomes. So I think that's a really, really important point, that we really need to think about culture sensitive development and kind of locally meaningful development values as well. And I think sort of the second point I'd like to make, and it's very sort of closely linked to the first point that I made, is that a culture really represents a system of knowledge and innovation. And in many African contexts, culture is a way of producing and transforming and transmitting knowledge. And in that sense, I think cultural and creative practitioners are often mediators between these kind of big global frameworks and local realities. And arts and culture and creative practitioners in that sense can really help to translate complex issues, for example, around climate change or public health, into kind of locally meaningful actions and thinking. So I think it is this sort of dual role of culture that is often overlooked. On the one hand, creating these social conditions for development, but also really sort of providing ways in which societies understand and respond to challenges. And I think this is, all these sort of dynamics are also why we see sort of this renewed momentum recently to establish a dedicated goal for culture in the post-2030 development agenda, because in the current sustainable development goals, there is no sort of standalone specific goal for culture. And the current kind of discourse, which by the way, has been going on for at least 2-3 decades. There have always been phases where UNESCO and other international bodies really advocated for this value of culture. But I think that if culture is not included in our global development frameworks, then there is a risk that this value and this transversal role of culture is overlooked, and that it is overlooked that culture really is a fundamental driver of sustainable development. Culture does not just support development, it's not just a vehicle for development, by, utilizing theater for development, by spreading messages. I think culture really underpins, development at a global and a local level.
And I agree with you. Despite being in a separate area of culture, I think it's been overlooked too often for too long. But I really like the ideas of community, trust that you mentioned, because culture feeds into community, that sense of community, and so does sustainable development effectively. It's funny, I see this in how you're speaking about this sort of informal glue that sticks all the parts together and makes it work. So to your point, it's not just about the few elements here and there that, or the messages that it brings. It's just how it acts as a glue to make it all work. And the idea of innovation and a system of knowledge, I really, really enjoy hearing, because I say this a lot, and I've been doing a bit of work on nomad and nomadic culture and the nomad mindset. And it's exactly what I put forward, is that nomads have always been cultural curators, and they were the ones bringing innovation back from wherever they were going and heading. And there's no reason why this should change in the more modern era, because effectively this is, by mixing all of this knowledge together, you bring something that really sticks together. So I really like what you're saying. So going back to effectively what we're talking about, how do you feel cultural intelligence would help businesses move beyond a donor/recipient sort of mindset into building more partnerships with the African creative and cultural sectors, and generate these partnerships effectively that are mutually beneficial? What are your thoughts on this?
I think, as we both agree, cultural intelligence can play a huge role and critical role in shifting this engagement, between businesses and African creative ecosystems. But I think it can only really happen if, as you say, we move away from this kind of donor-recipient model to more mutually beneficial and sort of equitable partnerships. And I think this can only happen if, cultural intelligence is really understood as a strategic and organizational capability, not just an individual skill. And I think it can only happen if cultural intelligence is also really embedded in business strategies, for example. And I think the problem is, I think that the reason why, this hasn't maybe happened as much as we would hope for is because I think these dynamics of power relationships and sort of asymmetries in knowledge and agenda setting, they still persist. And I think that maybe the first step is really to shift our focus, to really from thinking about as a business, how do we deliver support, to really moving towards asking how can we engage effectively with in a complex existing ecosystem. And I think that just a few sort of strategic shifts and steps that need to happen to move towards this kind of more beneficial partnership. And I wrote down a few notes in terms of kind of the steps that I would like to see. The first one is really to move from this kind of notion of transferring knowledge to kind of a mutual exchange, because I think in a lot of international collaboration settings or international initiatives, I think there is often still this, maybe not sort of explicit, but maybe implicit assumption that there is sort of a one direction flow of knowledge or expertise. I would say culturally intelligent organizations recognize that African creative ecosystems are rich in very context-specific, local, nuanced knowledge and also innovation and sort of interesting practices and maybe different ways of working. And as I think, the first point is really sort of engaging with that knowledge and engaging with that very nuanced understanding of a local context, which then I think is critical for example, developing products or narratives or branding strategies that actually then resonate in that very specific context. Linked to that then is sort of a second shift, I think that needs to happen. So sort of moving from maybe more traditional CSR to really an understanding of co-creation. And I think this really means working with creative practitioners as partners, in shaping, for example, brand narratives or customer engagement or even product development, because I think it's just really important to recognize that these African creative ecosystems, they're not just sites of impact. They're really sources of very nuanced understanding and insight. And then I think thirdly, and again, this is sort of linked to the previous 2 points, I think it's also really important to move from kind of pre-designed ways of doing things or pre-designed strategies or products or programs, whatever a business is working on, to really embedded collaboration. We have seen that in kind of global development for decades now, that these kind of one size fits all models just don't work. They fail, and I think it's the same for businesses and in a kind of more commercial context, that product placement, for example, just will fail if it is sort of insufficiently grounded in local realities. This is where cultural intelligence comes in, because it really means, I think, designing with local partners and with local creatives, and really kind of producing this shared ownership over objectives or formats and outcomes. And a fourth point that I'd like to make, and it's quite an obvious point, but unfortunately I think it also happens not enough, is really moving from this kind of short-term delivery to longer-term engagement, and even maybe engagement within the wider ecosystem, and sort of moving away from this kind of project-based, like short project-based work, to a longer kind of longer-term ecosystem engagement. Because I think, especially in the creative ecosystems, trust is a very critical currency. And we talked about the trust earlier when we talked about this relationship between culture and sustainable development. And I think obviously trust can't be built through kind of one-off very short interventions. This kind of longer term engagement really leads to stronger partnerships, and that then also obviously positively affects more sustainable and effective business outcomes. And then I think the last point I want to make, and again it's kind of linked to the others and it rounds up the others, I would say, but I think again, often partnerships are kind of shaped by external priorities and agendas, such as very kind of short-term branding objectives, or I don't know, in the development sector it's around reporting objectives. And I think, and this ties in with what we talked about earlier about the value of culture in general, I think cultural intelligence really highlights the importance of this kind of meaningful local value, and that then in turn really strengthens legitimacy and relevance and long-term impact that businesses can have as well. In summary, I would say that cultural intelligence really can enable a shift from this kind of more transactional relationship or engagement to a really kind of mutually beneficial and co-creative partnership, where really both sides are recognized as contributors to innovation, for example, and not just beneficiaries of some type of support.
All the entrepreneurs of this world know the only way to succeed is to look far ahead and into the future. And in fact, someone I interviewed recently was talking how they have a 500-year business plan, which I thought was brilliant, because there's such a sense of legacy in terms of what they're trying to achieve with their businesses. So I completely agree. And the qualitative element, balancing out the quantitative one, is also very, very important. So looking at things in a more concrete way, could you share perhaps one or two examples of initiatives that have been really fruitful in this space, where the collaboration with the local cultural and creative sector has really been beneficial for some businesses, whether it's around, looking at market development, brand building, or community relations? Do you have some examples that you could share, whether you've contributed to them or not?
I would say one of the most powerful roles of the cultural and creative sector in Africa is really this ability to act as a bridge, between businesses and context and communities and customers, because they can really provide this really deep, nuanced market insight, and really shape culturally resonant brands, and also enable more meaningful community engagement. And I think there are lots of examples we could discuss, but I think the first one I'd like to highlight is quite, I would say, a well-known example around building brands and cultural relevance, because a lot of global brands like Nike, for example, have collaborated in the past with African designers and creatives to really shape products and campaigns that reflect local aesthetics and identities. And I think this is not just about, you know, an attempt of localization. It's really, I think, about drawing on these creative ecosystems, on this creative expertise, you know, that exists locally as sources of innovation and cultural insight, which I would argue then ultimately, you know, also strengthens kind of the global brand relevance overall. So I think yeah, sort of the key insight from this kind of first example is really that creative practitioners can bring a level of cultural nuance and understanding that often, I would argue, traditional market research can't capture. And then I think the second example I would like to give it's kind of maybe a more locally relevant example to me here in Nairobi. It's around, again, kind of market insight and community engagement in relation to sectors like urban development or you know, infrastructure, and you know, in cities like Nairobi, but also other big cities like Lagos, for example, real estate developers and urban initiatives really work with cultural organizations and creative practitioners to activate, for example, public spaces, you know, to maybe create a different narrative around a specific area or a specific space, you know, through festivals or exhibitions, or maybe more community-led cultural programming. And so, for example, here in Nairobi, you know, where I live, there's a very established, well-known creative hub called the Golden Arts Center, and the Golden Arts Center has played a huge and really, really important role in, for example, shaping how communities engage with development processes in specific areas, and in particular around the area where this creative hub is placed. So I think for businesses, and I would argue it doesn't matter what kind of business they are, but I think for businesses, this kind of collaboration really provides real-time insights into community dynamics and aspirations and concerns, while at the same time building trust and legitimacy, which, you know, we discussed earlier is so crucial. This example then kind of brings me back again to what I said earlier, you know, that I think artists and cultural organizations are often seen as more trusted and accessible intermediaries than, for example, some corporate actors or public institutions. And I think this is really, really important, especially in contexts where trust in institutions is low, or where maybe trust in certain types of businesses is limited. What these examples highlight is really that collaboration with the creative sector and cultural intelligence, you know, are not just about visibility. It's really about these very nuanced insights about creating connections and about building trust and legitimacy.
It's interesting because on this side of the world, there's a lot, and particularly, I mean, I work with UK market quite a lot at an international level, but with UK brands or agencies, and culture is an absolute buzzword, and everyone is trying to find ways to, you know, find their space in culture, what's their role in culture, and yet those partnerships don't happen very regularly. So it's just really interesting, and I think, again, it's probably because sometimes people miss out on the value that it's actually bringing to the brand, and not seeing it, to your point earlier on, as a strategic foundation, as opposed to just another activation, so to speak. So in terms of wrapping up, I was thinking we could potentially look at the future, and to see your view in terms of, if we were to look into 10, 15 years away from now, what do you feel would be the ideal relationship between businesses and the African cultural and creative settings, and how companies should be looking at this already, and what are the steps to be put into place to create those partnerships that we mentioned earlier on?
Yeah, looking ahead to kind of 10, 15 years, I would say an ideal relationship between businesses and the creative ecosystems across Africa would mean moving away from this kind of more traditional sponsorship and this kind of more conventional approach to CSR, and moving more towards this kind of deeper long-term integration, you know, where creative ecosystems are really recognized as a strategic partner in innovation, in market development, and also kind of, you know, broader kind of social impact. Key shifts that I would say would need to happen to move towards this, and, you know, sort of, you know, we discussed sort of seeing creative ecosystems as co-creators, co-innovators, and not just beneficiaries, moving away from this kind of short-term project engagement to really thinking about engaging with the kind of broader ecosystem. And I think that in particular is really, really important, because if, you know, companies, for example, invest in the more kind of broader ecosystem through, you know, infrastructure, skills, development networks and platforms, that strengthens the ecosystem, which then in the long term, you know, is also beneficial to these businesses, because it creates, you know, stronger connected systems and not just these kind of one-off interventions. We also discussed the importance of really developing a sense of this kind of shared value, this mutual benefit, and really kind of also shared accountability. I think that's also really, really important. And then I guess, yeah, to your question, you know, how do we get there though? Because, you know, this all sounds very nice, but what does it mean in practice, and how do we actually get there? I would say overall comes back to, you know, what I mentioned earlier about really positioning cultural intelligence as a strategic asset to a business, and not just as a sort of nice have, you know. And this really, I think, means repositioning CSR from just, you know, philanthropy to really a strategic investment. Because I think in the first instance, for example, businesses could really use CSR to explore, you know, what can deeper collaboration actually look like, you know, to really, I don't know, maybe run some pilots and experiment and see what works also in different contexts. You know, what can this kind of mutually beneficial, equitable relationship look like in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Sierra Leone? I would argue the first step could be using CSR as sort of a mode of experimentation. And then I think linked to that is, yeah, a shift from this kind of more sort of conventional model of funding to really a more sort of a model of kind of designing a partnership, and you know, and really sort of involving partners such as creative practitioners from the get-go, you know, in shaping an approach, in shaping a strategy, in shaping products, in shaping success metrics as well. And obviously all of this needs longer term engagement and building this trust. Another step that is really, really important is also investing in intermediaries and platforms, because you know, we see that now already in a lot of African contexts, that the most effective collaborations are enabled by cultural organizations or hubs or networks that can really bridge, you know, businesses to individual practitioners, but also communities. Supporting, you know, these intermediaries is also a more longer term sustainable approach than just funding, you know, isolated individual projects. And I would say finally, sort of the last step is really sort of embedding, excuse me, learning loops, you know. So really using these engagements and these partnerships as opportunities also to build their own cultural intelligence, you know, so that it's really like a learning loop where insights about markets, about audiences, about customers are captured. And then that then, you know, feeds into the next cycle of partnerships and collaborations, and to really, to really use these insights sort of, you know, sustainably and in the longer term. In summary, I would say that the goal is really to move away from this more kind of conventional approach to CSR to culture really as a strategic capability within a business.
Thank you so much, Kathrin. And I think, yeah, this is a really good way to finish and to conclude and to wrap it up. I think there is a lot of untapped opportunity on the African continent as a whole. And I like to be optimist. And I think even from a business perspective, a lot of companies will soon realize how much the continent is growing, and that is demographically included because it's one of the youngest continents and it has a lot of potential for the future. I think historically, this gap in cultural intelligence is what has blocked businesses from doing this and expanding. And I'm very hopeful that this will change in the future. And hopefully that will be through, cultural intelligence, and in the cultural spaces in general. That will be the solid foundation to bring all of this together. So thank you again, Kathrin, for your time today. It's been really interesting. And to those watching, this is Insight Connect, where cultural intelligence lands. And so it did again today. And there will be more interesting exchange. So watch this space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melanie. It was a real pleasure, and I enjoyed our discussion. Thank you.